Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey you guys, welcome to Knowing Animals, the podcast. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Now this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by three very important and very distinguished sponsors. First up we have ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Regular listeners of Knowing Animals will know ASA very well. They have supported Knowing Animals for quite a few years now. ASA is the membership body for academics, artists and advocates interested in animal issues. Now ASA does very good work to support animal studies scholars. You can follow ASA at their Facebook page. You can also join ASA by going to their website, the Australasian Animal Studies Association ASA website. Supporting ASA is a way to support animal studies, so please think about joining ASA, the organisation that supports animal studies scholars and artists. Our second sponsor is a new sponsor. Our second sponsor is actually a book. The book is called After Coetzee, an anthology of animal fictions. Now, After Coetzee is published by Faunary Press. That's Faunay Press. Now, people who have been following animal issues for many years will know that Coetzee has had a very big impact on animal studies. Coetzee is a very, very well-regarded writer. He is a winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature, and he often addresses very tricky and important animal issues. So this book is a very good way about thinking about the impact that Coetzee has had on animal fictions. So I highly recommend the book to you. You can find out more about where to find the book in the notes for this podcast. And my recommendation is that you go and buy a copy, one for yourself, but also order one for your university library. So that's the book After Coetzee, an anthology of animal fictions. Grab one for your university or local library. Right, our final sponsor is Kibble. That is Kibbl. Now, Kibble is a new app that has been developed to data mine information from the web about adoptable pets from pounds and animal sanctuaries. And it's also an app that you can use to raise money for animal charities. So I have been following Kibble on Facebook, and I have to warn you, they have some very, very adorable animals that are currently at pounds or animal shelters looking for their forever home. But Kibble isn't just something that can be followed on Facebook. They're also an app. So go to your local app store, Google Play or such, and download Kibble. It's a free app, and by using it, you'll be helping animals find their forever home. You can learn more about Kibble by going to their website, which is kibbl.io, and you can learn more information about the organisation and the work they do by, again, having a look at the podcast notes. So there are our three sponsors for this episode, and I thank them very much for their support. Right, this episode is coming to you all the way from Switzerland. I'm very, very privileged to be attending a conference at the University of Freiburg all about political representation for the unrepresented. And we're going to have a couple of episodes coming out of that conference, or that workshop, I should say. And the first one is I'll be speaking to Associate Professor Alfonso Donosco. Did I do the word?
Donosco.
Yeah. So as list...
And I should precise, I'm assistant professor.
Assistant professor, beg your pardon. So Alfonso is from Chile's Catholic University, and today we're going to be discussing his piece representing non-human interests, and it appeared in the journal Environmental Values in 2017. It's a very interesting but somewhat complicated piece, so Alfonso, I'm sure he's going to help us understand the central gist of it. Welcome to the podcast, Alfonso.
Hi, Siobhan. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's nice talking to you.
And it's so wonderful that we can be here in Switzerland and have a
Wonderful.
conversation between an Australian and a Chilean. So, Alfonso, could you start by telling us what led you to write this journal article?
Yeah. I should start saying that I became interested in environmental ethics quite recently. I used to teach this class on global justice, and 2 or 3 weeks of this course were on issues about climate justice, rights over natural resources, responsibilities for CO2 emissions and so on. So things that somehow involve the environment and nature. But while reading this literature, this very interesting and important literature, I realized that all these authors had a very specific approach, which was an anthropocentric approach. And I thought this wasn't satisfactory. I thought we need to include other angles of analysis here. So I decided to start reading the literature on environmental ethics and the value of nature, intrinsic non-anthropocentric value of nature, and so on. So I started teaching also a course in environmental ethics and justice. And this is to answer your question. My approach to all these issues were always an approach from someone coming from political philosophy. So my interest in environmental ethics was always mediated by my interest in justice, political legitimacy, authority, coercion, and so on. And I think this piece is an expression of that. It's an attempt to put together two different literatures using the concept of political and legal representation applied to the non-human natural world. Yeah.
So the concept of anthropocentric and non-anthropocentric principles and norms is really important to your paper. Can you explain to the listener what you mean by those terms?
Sure. Well, there is a big literature on this distinction between anthropocentric and non-anthropocentric approaches to different concepts and theories. But what I'm trying to say here by this distinction is simply to claim that there is non-derivative value in the natural world. So not all sources of value depend on what is important for human beings, but also there is value and non-derivative or intrinsic, as some philosophers say, intrinsic value in the idea of or in the good of non-human entities.
And you also further argue, though, that the entity themselves doesn't need to be aware of the value. Is that right?
Yeah, that's one of the most perhaps controversial aspects of the paper. And there I follow a philosopher called Gary Barnett, who has this non-conventional theory of interest. So normally we think that interest, or that an organism, an entity has an interest if and only if has a desire for something or has some mental state, a belief, a desire basically. But that theory of interest forgets that sometimes, and there are cases in human beings as well, that we may not have a desire for something and still it's plausible, it makes sense to say, well, there is an interest. This individual has an interest in something. So, for example, a person with a human being with a severe brain damage may not have any kind of desire for being fed. However, we would say, well, of course there is an interest, even though this person cannot take an interest in satisfying this interest. So that's what I mean by this idea of you may have interest without at the same time having a desire or mental state for that X that you have an interest for. Yeah.
So that then helps you expand your principles beyond the non-human animal into the non-human world.
Exactly.
So as you point out, even though your dog might not understand what's going on, we can still perhaps agree that your dog likes to chase a ball.
Yeah.
But a tree might also have interests, but there's no capacity for a tree to perhaps articulate or make sense of.
Yeah. So that's why this paper may be special for your listeners, because this is not really about animals, goes beyond that, because animals are sentient beings. And as sentient beings, they may have mental state and desires, as my dog Ayla. And that's the example I give in the paper. But because we don't need mental states, that's what I claim following Gary Barner's theory of psychobiological interest. So biological interests without mental states are also proper interest. If we accept that, then we could say that entities that do not have mental states, like trees, plants, so any living being that is not even sentient, may have an interest. And that's why I can expand my account of interest to the non-sentient natural world. Yeah.
So I host a monthly, I co-host a monthly reading group with Dr. Dinesh Wadiwal and Dr. John Hadley. It's called Animal Rights in Sydney. And I'm finding, I think we're all finding increasingly that in the reading group, there's a lot of discussion about the non-human animal world and the plant world. And my sense is that the kind of older generation of animal theorists are not so comfortable with the kind of principles that have been expanded from humans to non-human animals, then also being expanded beyond to the non-human, non-animal world. Are plants and animals similar in lots of ways, or how similar are they?
I couldn't disagree with the idea that they are very different, and that perhaps they even have different moral significance. But I would still claim that both have moral status, and that moral status should count for something. I do not deny differences, which is just a descriptive fact that animals are different from plants. However, I would defend the idea that plants also have a moral status, and that moral status should count and should impose certain kind of obligations on the human realm or moral agents.
And in your field, do you then need to grapple with, say, a transition from an entity that's clearly a plant into an entity that's perhaps no longer a living plant? So, for example, rocks, landscapes, etc. Do they have some kind of standing, or?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't accept that. Although there are some authors that try to expand this to all the existing beings. I disagree with that because I don't see what could provide moral status to these entities. But in the case of plants and any other living being, there is relevant interest that give these entities a moral status, and therefore, if they have a moral status, we should be sensitive to that moral status, as we're sensitive to moral agents, human beings, animals, or as we should be sensitive to these entities. Yeah.
So your starting point is that non-humans, and I think you want to include non-human animals and non-human non-animals, are owed political representation. Why is political representation important?
Yeah. It is important because it's the way that in a political community we can protect the vulnerable and the interest of the vulnerable. And as I see this issue, animals, non-human animals, and non-human living organisms that are not sentient, plants and so on, are vulnerable to our political decisions, and they should be included in the way we establish public policies and so on. So that's why I think it's important. It's the way we can protect and respect and recognize the interest of these entities.
Do we not do that already, though?
How?
Well, we make, say, public policy about, say, parkland, forests.
Yeah, I think, of course, and I give, in the workshop I will give some examples of how we actually do that. But generally, and I would say most cases of natural world protection depend on an anthropocentric premise, that protection is useful for human beings or for future generations of human beings. And I disagree with that approach. I think we should protect non-human animals and the non-human, non-sentient living world for their own sake, for their own good. So even though I could accept that we now protect these entities, I think we should take a different approach, because that's the way we would really respect those entities as what they are, moral entities with a moral status and so on. It's not instrumental approach to the natural world, but it should be a non-instrumental, non-derivative value approach to the natural world. Yeah.
Do you think to date we've done a better job in relation to non-human animals than the rest of the natural world in taking a non-anthropocentric approach, or do you think both are lacking?
No, I would definitely say that both are lacking, but it's easier, I would say, to respect and recognize the interest of the non-animal, the non-human, of the animals, because they are sentient, and in that sense they are closer to us, and there is some degree of empathy between the two of us. It's much more difficult to do that, and in my theory, it's not required that empathy with the natural, non-sentient world. But yeah, I think that closeness with the animal, non-human animal world makes our public policies more sensitive to their interests and their needs. Yeah.
So, what kind of changes would you like to see come about as a result of this kind of theorization or your work?
Well, I think this is an aspiration. I mean, this is not. I'm not suggesting a specific public policy to be implemented right now. I think, actually, I say this in the paper. This is an incremental strategy. We should get closer and closer, take steps to get there, to get to this idea of what I call, this is the name of the general theory, ecological justice. So I think some laws in some countries, in Switzerland, for example, in Germany, are taking steps towards this idea of representing these interests, of recognizing the value of the non-human animal world and the non-human natural non-sentient world. But so that's what I would expect, that's what I would hope, that my account helps to articulate and make coherent this idea in the political realm. Yeah.
Wonderful. So, Alfonso, I ask everybody who comes on Knowing Animals to answer 5 quick questions. Now, normally the 5 quick questions are very much around animal studies, but sometimes I expand them out or mix them up a little bit depending on who I'm speaking to. So in your case, perhaps we'll include animal studies and also ecological studies and justice issues. So can you recall the first piece of pro-animal or pro-environmental scholarship you ever read?
Yeah, there's, I don't know if you know this author, is a Spanish philosopher called Jesus Mosterin. He wrote this book called Vivan los Animales, which is an expression that has different interpretation, different readings. This is a very nice book I read, I don't know, 10 years ago. And for me, it was very important. But I stopped there. I just read the book and left it there. And now when I was thinking about this interview, I was thinking, oh, that book, I never took it again with me, and I just need to read it again and so on. But yeah, I would say that's the first one. And then later on, when I started more systematically studying issues about environmental ethics, Kenneth Goodpaster on being morally considerable, that's a very important paper and for me, and that was one of the first readings later on. Yeah.
Wonderful. So can you recall the first piece you wrote?
Yeah, it was a section of a paper on territorial rights. So I claim in that section that this territorial rights of the state over natural resources should be constrained by the interests of the animal world living in that territory.
Wonderful.
Yeah. It hasn't been published, and I really hope to work on it further to publish it. Yeah.
Oh, good. So if you had to name one scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Christopher Stone, Should Trees Have Standing? I think that's a very important book for me, and the important article as well. And yeah, that influenced a lot of my work, because I think he's a lawyer, but his approach from institutions, from public institutions toward the natural world is very, it motivates my work. Yeah, I would mention him. And of course, there is the Peter Singer stuff that also very influential. It kind of sets the tone of much of the discussion, and for me it's also very important.
Yeah. So what's the most important thing academics can do for animals and or the natural world?
Yeah. Well, there are very different kinds of academics. Academics with very public profiles and academics with more research profile and so on. In my case, I think teaching. Teaching is a very important aspect of my work, and I think there is where you can really see flourish your work and your interest in students, talking to them about these things and making clear how important these topics are for the life of others, but also for their own lives.
Yeah, wonderful. So if you had the power to change one thing about the human relationship with the animal world or the natural world, what would you like that to be?
Well, definitely extensive animal farming, torturing animals to eat them and to satisfy very banal interest of some human beings. Yeah, that's something that should be changed, definitely.
Well, Alfonso, what are you working on next?
I'm working on, I have two big projects. One is on ecological justice. It's a project funded by the Chilean government. And this is my first year. I'm just doing research and traveling, talking to different people about this idea of ecological justice, the kind of institutions ecological justice demands or requires from the state. So that's the first I would mention, which is very much related to the work you read, this paper published in Environmental Values. And the second one is a very interesting project on the Antarctica. Political philosophy looks to the Antarctica is called, and this is funded by the Research Council of Norway. So Alejandra Mancilla is a Chilean scholar that works for the University of Oslo, and she invited me and 5 other political philosophers to work on the issue of the Antarctic and territorial rights. And there I hoped also to introduce my interest in this idea of territorial rights for animals and the natural world. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. Antarctica is an issue that Australia tries to get very involved with.
Yeah.
You're probably aware. Yeah. So, Alfonso, how can people find out more about your work?
I have a webpage in academia.edu and also in my university, Institute of Political Science and Universidad Católica. There they can find more information.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Alfonso. And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals, or you can follow me at so_s. You can also like us on Facebook. And of course, don't forget, as always, please leave a review at iTunes. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.